The idiot cannot learn from experience at all because a new process in his liquid brain does not modify structure, while the fool uses what he has learned only inaptly and in frivolous fragments because his stretches of linked experience are short and their connections insecure. But when the cerebral plasm is fresh and well disposed, and when the paths are clear, attention is consecutive and learning easy. A multitude of details can be gathered into a single cycle of memory or of potential regard. Under such circumstances, action is the unimpeded expression of healthy instinct in an environment squarely faced. Conduct from the first then issues in progress, and by reinforcing its own organization at each rehearsal makes progress continual. For there will subsist not only a readiness to act in a great precision in action, but if any significant circumstance has varied in the conditions or in the interest at stake, this change will make itself felt. It will check the process and prevent precipitate action. Precipitate action. Yeah. Deliberation or well-funded scruple has the same source as facility, a plastic and quick organization. To be sensitive to difficulties and dangers goes with being sensitive to opportunities. Of all reason's embodiments, art is therefore the most splendid and complete. Merely to attain categories by which inner experiences may be articulated, or to feign analogies by which a universe may be conceived, would be but a visionary triumph if it remained ineffectual and went with no actual remodeling of the outer world. To render man's dwelling more appropriate and his mind better fed and more largely transmissible, mind grows self-perpetuating only by its expression in matter. What makes progress possible is that rational action may leave traces in nature, such that nature is in consequence, furnishes a better basis for the life of reason. In other words, progress is art bettering the conditions of existence. Until art arises, all achievement is internal to the brain, dies with the individual, and even in him spends itself without recovery, like music heard in a dream, art in establishing instruments for human life beyond the human body, and molding outer things into sympathy with inner values, establishes a ground whence values may continually spring up. The thatch that protects from today's rain will last and keep out tomorrow's rain also. The sign that once expresses an idea will serve to recall it in future. Not only does the work of art thus perpetuate its own function and produce a better experience, but the process of art also perpetuates itself, because it is teachable. Every animal learns something by living, but if his offspring inherit only what he possessed at birth, they have to learn life's lessons over again from the beginning, with, at best, some vague help given by their parents' example. But when the fruits of experience exist in the common environment, when new instruments unknown to nature are offered to each individual for his better equipment, although he must still learn for himself how to live, he may learn in a humaner school, where artificial occasions are constantly open to him for expanding his powers. It is no longer merely hidden inner processes that he must reproduce to attain his predecessor's wisdom. He may acquire much of it more expeditiously by imitating their outward habit, and imitation, furthermore, they have some means of exacting from him. Wherever there is art, there is a possibility of training. A father who calls his idle sons from the jungle to help him mold the plow not only inures them to labor, but compels them to observe the earth upturned and refreshed, and to watch the germination there. Their wandering thought, their incipient rebellions will be met by the hope of harvest, and it will not be impossible for them, when their father is dead, to follow the plow of their own initiative and for their own children's sake. So great is the sustained advance in rationality made possible by art, which, being embodied in matter, is teachable and transmissible by training. For in art, the values secured are recognized the more easily for having been first enjoyed when other people furnished the means to them, while the maintenance of these values is facilitated by an external tradition imposing itself contagiously or by force on each new generation. Art is action which, transcending the body, makes the world a more congenial stimulus to the soul. All art is therefore useful and practical, and the notable aesthetic value which some works of art possess for reasons flowing for the most part out of their moral significance is itself one of the satisfactions which art offers to human nature as a whole. Between sensation and abstract discourse lies a region of deployed sensibility or synthetic representation, a region where more is seen at arm's length than in any one moment could be felt at close quarters, and yet there the remote parts of experience, which discourse reaches only through symbols, are recovered and recomposed in something like their native colors and experienced relations. This region, called imagination, has pleasures more airy and luminous than those of sense, more massive and rapturous than those of intelligence. The values inherent in imagination, in instant intuition, in sense endowed with form, are called aesthetic values. They are found mainly in nature and living beings, but often also in man's artificial works and images evoked by language, and in the realm of sound. Productions in which an aesthetic value is or is supposed to be prominent take the name of fine art. But the work of fine art, so defined, is almost always an abstraction from the actual object, which has many non-aesthetic functions and values. To separate the aesthetic element, abstract and dependent as it often is an artifice which is more misleading than helpful, for neither in the history of art nor in a rational estimate of its own value can the aesthetic function of things be divorced from the practical and moral. What had to be done was, by imaginative races, done imaginatively. What had to be spoken or made was spoken or made fitly, lovingly, beautifully. Or to take the matter up on its psychological side, the ceaseless experimentation and ferment of ideas in breeding what it had a propensity to breed came sometimes on figments that gave it delightful pause. These beauties were the first knowledges, and these arrests the first hints of real and useful things. The rose's grace could more easily be plucked from its petals than the beauty of art from its subject, occasion, and use. Aesthetic fragrance, indeed, all things may have, if in soliciting man's senses or reason they can awaken his imagination as well. But this middle zone is so mixed and nebulous, and its limits are so vague that it cannot well be treated in theory otherwise than as it exists in fact, as a phase of man's sympathy with the world he moves in. If art is that element in the life of reason which consists in modifying its environment the better to attain its end, art may be expected to subserve all parts of the human ideal, to increase man's comfort, knowledge, and delight. And as nature, in her measure, is wont to satisfy these interests together, so art, in seeking to increase that satisfaction, will work simultaneously in every ideal direction. Nor will any of these directions be on the whole good or tempt a well-trained will if it leads to estrangement from all other interests. The aesthetic good will be accordingly hatched in the same nest with the others, and capable of flying far in a different air. Dogmatism in matters of taste has the same status as dogmatism in other spheres. It is initially justified by sincerity, being a systematic expression of a man's preferences, but it becomes absurd when its basis in a particular disposition is ignored and it pretends to have an absolute or metaphysical scope. Reason with the order which in every region it imposes on life, is grounded on animal nature and has no other function than to serve the same, and it fails to exercise its office quite as much when it oversteps its bounds. And forgets whom it is serving, as when it neglects some part of its legitimate province and serves its master imperfectly, without considering all his interests. Dialectic logic and morals lose their authority and become inept if they trespass upon the realm of physics and try to disclose existences. While physics is a mere idea in the realm of poetic meditation, so the notorious diversities which human taste exhibits do not become conflicts. And raise no moral problem until their basis or their function has been forgotten, and each has claimed a right to assert itself exclusively. This claim is altogether absurd, and we might fail to understand how so preposterous an attitude could be assumed by anybody did we not remember that every young animal thinks himself absolute, and that dogmatism in the thinker is only the speculative side of greed and courage in the brute. The brute cannot surrender his appetites nor abdicate his primary right to dominate his environment. What experience and reason may teach him is merely how to make his self-assertion well-balanced and successful. In the same way, taste is bound to maintain its preferences, but free to rationalize them. After a man has compared his feelings with no less legitimate feelings of other creatures, he can reassert his own with more complete authority, since now he is aware of the necessary ground in his nature and of their affinities with whatever other interests his nature enables him to recognize in others and to coordinate with his own. The criterion of taste is, therefore, nothing but taste itself in its more deliberate and circumspect form. Reflection refines particular sentiments by bringing them into sympathy with all rational life. There is consequentially the greatest possible difference in authority between taste and taste. And while delight in drums and eagle's feathers is perfectly genuine and has no cause to blush for itself, it cannot be compared in scope or representative value with delight in symphony, or an epic. The very instinct that is satisfied by beauty prefers one beauty to another, and we have only to question and purge our aesthetic feelings in order to obtain our criterion of taste. This criterion will be natural, personal, autonomous, a circumstance that will give it authority over our own judgment, which is all moral science is concerned about, and will extend its authority over other minds also, in so far as their constitution is similar to ours, in that measure what is a genuine instance of reason in us, others will recognize for a genuine expression of reason in themselves also. Aesthetic feeling in different people may take up a different fraction of life and vary greatly in volume. The more nearly insensible a man is, the more incompetent he becomes to proclaim the values which sensibility might have. To beauty, men are habitually insensible, even while they are awake and rationally active. Tomes of aesthetic criticism hang on a few moments of real delight and intuition. It is in rare and scattered instance that beauty smiles even on her adorers, who are reduced for habitual comfort to remembering her past favors. An aesthetic glow may pervade experience, but that circumstance is seldom remarked. It figures only as an influence working subterraneously on thoughts and judgments which in themselves take a cognitive or practical direction. Only when the aesthetic ingredient becomes predominant do we proclaim how beautiful. Ordinarily, the pleasures which formal perception gives remain an undistinguished part of our comfort or curiosity. Taste is formed in those moments when aesthetic emotion is massive and distinct. Preferences then grown conscious, judgments then put into words, will reverberate through calmer hours. They will constitute prejudices, habits of apperception, secret standards for all other beauties. A period of life in which such intuitions have been frequent may amass tastes and ideals sufficient for the rest of our days. Youth in these matters governs maturity, and while men may develop their early impressions more systematically and find confirmations of them in various quarters, they will seldom look at the world afresh or use new categories in deciphering it. Half our standards come from our first masters, the other half from our first loves. Never being so deeply stirred again, remain persuaded that no objects save those we then discovered can have a true sublimity. These high-water marks of aesthetic life may easily be reached under tutelage. It may be some eloquent appreciations read in a book or some preference expressed by a gifted friend that may have revealed unsuspected beauties in art or nature. And then, since our own perception was vicarious and obviously inferior in volume to that which our mentor possessed, we shall take his judgments for our criterion, since they were the source and exemplar of all our own. Thus the volume and intensity of some appreciations, especially when nothing of the kind has preceded, makes them authoritative over our subsequent judgments. On those warm moments hang all our cold systematic opinions, and while the latter fill our days and shape our careers, it is only the former that are crucial and alive. A race which loves beauty holds the same place in history that a season of love or enthusiasm holds in individual life. Such a race has a preeminent right to pronounce upon beauty and to bequeath its judgments to duller peoples. We may accordingly listen with reverence to Greek judgment on that subject, expecting that what might seem to us wrong about it is the expression of knowledge and passion beyond our range. It will suffice that we learn to live in the world of beauty instead of merely studying its relics. For us to understand, for instance, that imitation is a fundamental principle in art, and that any rational judgment on the beautiful must be a moral and political judgment, enveloping chance aesthetic feelings and determining their value. What most German philosophers, on the contrary, have written about art and beauty has a minimal importance. It treats artificial problems in a grammatical spirit, seldom giving any proof of experience or imagination. What painters say about painting and poets about poetry is better than lay opinion. It may reveal, of course, some petty jealousy or some partial incapacity, because a special gift often carries with it complementary defects in apprehension. Yet, what is positive in such judgments is founded on knowledge and avoids the romancing into which literatures and sentimentalists will gladly wander. The specific values of art are technical values, more permanent and definite than the advantageous analogies on which a stray observer usually bases his views. Only a technical education can raise judgments on musical compositions above impertinent autobiography. The Japanese know the beauty of flowers, and tailors and dressmakers have the best sense for the fashions. We ask them for suggestions, and if we do not always take their advice, it is not because the fine effects they love are not genuine, but because they may not be effects which we care to produce. This touches a second consideration besides the volume and vivacity of feeling which enters into good taste. What is voluminous may be inwardly confused or outwardly confusing. Excitement, though on the whole and for the moment agreeable, may verge on pain and may be, when it subsides a little, a cause of bitterness. A thing's attractions may be partly at war with its ideal function. In such a case, what, in our haste, we call a beauty becomes hateful on a second view, and according to the key of our dissatisfaction, we pronounce that effect meretricious, harsh, or affected. These discords appear when elaborate things are attempted without enough art and refinement. They are essentially in bad taste. Rudimentary effects, on the contrary, are pure, and though we may think them trivial when we are expecting something richer, their defect is never intrinsic. They do not plunge us, as impure excitements do, into a corrupt artificial conflict. So wildflowers, plain chant, or a scarlet uniform are beautiful enough. Their simplicity is a positive merit, while their crudity is only relative. There is a touch of sophistication and disease in not being able to fall back on such things and enjoy them thoroughly, as if a man could no longer relish a glass of water. Your true epicure will study not to lose so genuine a pleasure. Better forego some artificial stimulus, though that, too, has its charm, than become insensible to natural joys. Indeed, ability to revert to elementary beauties is a test that judgment remains sound. Vulgarity is quite another matter. An old woman in a blonde wig, a dirty hand covered with jewels, ostentation without dignity, rhetoric without cogency, all offended by an inner contradiction. To like such things we should have to surrender our better intuitions and suffer a kind of dishonor. Yet the elements offensively combined may be excellent in isolation, so that an untrained or torpid mind would be at a loss to understand the critic's displeasure. Oftentimes barbaric art almost succeeds by dint of splendor in banishing the sense of confusion and absurdity, for everything, even reason, must bow to force. Yet the impression remains chaotic, and we must be either partly inattentive or partly distressed. Nothing could show better than this alternative how mechanical barbaric art is, driven by blind impulse or tradition. The artist has worked in the dark, has dismissed his work without having quite understood it or really justified it to his own mind. It is rather his excretion than his product. Astonished, very likely, at his own fertility, he has thought himself divinely inspired, little knowing that clear reason is the highest and truest of inspirations. Other men observing his obscure work have then honored him for profundity, and so mere bulk or stress or complexity have produced the mystical wonder by which generation after generation may be enthralled. Barbaric art is half necromantic. Its ascendancy rests in a certain measure on bewilderment and fraud. To purge away these impurities, nothing is needed but quickened intelligence, a keener spiritual flame. Where perception is adequate, expression is so too. And if a man will only grow sensitive to the various solicitations which anything monstrous combines, he will thereby perceive its monstrosity. Let him but enact his sensations. Let him pause to make explicit the confused hints and threaten to stupefy him. He will find that he can follow out each of them only by rejecting and forgetting the others. To free his imagination in any direction he must disengage it from the contrary intent. And so he must either purify either purify his object or leave it a mass of confused promptings. Promptings essentially demand to be carried out, and when once an idea has become articulate, it is not enriched by but destroyed if it is still identified with its contrary. I'm going to go back to the top of the paragraph. To purge away these impurities, nothing is needed but quickened intelligence, a keener spiritual flame. Where perception is adequate, expression is so too. If a man will only grow sensitive to the various solicitations which anything monstrous combines, he will thereby perceive its monstrosity. Let him but enact his sensations, let him pause to make explicit the confused hints that threaten to stupefy him. He will find that he can follow out each of them only by rejecting and forgetting the others. To free his imagination in any direction, he must disengage it from the contrary intent, and so he must either purify his object or leave it a mass of confused promptings. Promptings essentially demand to be carried out, and when once an idea has become articulate, it is not enriched but destroyed if it is still identified with its contrary. Any complete expression of a barbarous theme will therefore disengage its incompatible elements and turn it into a number of rational beauties. When good taste has in this way purified and digested some turbid medley, it still has a progress to make. Ideas, like men, live in society. Not only has each a will of its own and an inherent ideal, but each finds itself conditioned for its expression by a host of other beings, on whose co-operation it depends. Good taste, besides being inwardly clear, has to be outwardly fit. A monstrous ideal devours and dissolves itself, but even a rational one does not find an immortal embodiment simply for being inwardly possible and free from contradiction. It needs a material basis, a soil and situation propitious to its growth. This basis, as it varies, makes the ideal vary, which is simply its expression, and therefore no ideal can be ultimately fixed in ignorance of the conditions that may modify it. It subsists, to be sure, as an eternal possibility, independently of all further earthly revolutions. Once expressed, it has revealed the inalienable values that attain to a certain form of being whenever that form is actualized, but its expression may have been only momentary, and that eternal ideal may have no further relevance to the living world. The criterion of taste, however, looks to a social career. It hopes to educate and to judge. In order to be an applicable and a just law, it must represent interests over which it would preside. There are many undiscovered ideals. There are many beauties which nothing in this world can embody or suggest. There are also many once suggested or even embodied, which find later their basis gone and evaporate into their native heaven. The saddest tragedy in the world is the destruction of what has within it no inward ground of dissolution, death in youth, and the crushing out of perfection. Imagination has its bereavements of this kind. The complete mastery of existence achieved at one moment gives no warrant that it will be sustained or achieved again at the next. The achievement may have been perfect. Nature will not on that account stop to admire it. She will move on, and the meaning which was read so triumphantly in her momentary attitude will not fit her new posture. Like Polonius's cloud, she will always suggest some new ideal because she has none of her own. In lieu of an idea, however, nature has a constitution, and this, which is necessary ground for our ideals, is what it concerns the ideal to reckon with. A poet, spokesman of his full soul at a given juncture, cannot consider eventualities or think of anything but the message he is sent to deliver, whether the world can then hear it or not. God, he may feel sure, understands him, and in the eternal, the beauty he sees and loves, immortality justifies his enthusiasm. Nevertheless, Critics must view his momentary evolution from another side. They do not come to justify the poet in his own eyes. He amply relieves them of such a function. They come only to inquire how significant the poet's expressions are for humanity at large, or for whatever public he addresses. They come to register the social or representative value of the poet's soul. His inspiration may have been an odd cerebral rumbling, a perfectly irrecoverable and wasted intuition. The exquisite quality it doubtless had to his own sense is now not to the purpose. A work of art is a public possession. It is addressed to the world. By taking on a material embodiment, a spirit solicits attention and claims some kinship with the prevalent gods. Has it, critics should ask, the affinities needed for such intercourse? It is humane, it is rational, is it representative? To its inherent, incommunicable charms, it must add a kind of courtesy. If it wants other approval than its own, it cannot afford to regard no other aspiration. This scope, this representative faculty, or wide appeal is necessary to good taste. All authority is representative. Force and inner consistency are gifts on which I may well congratulate another, but they give him no right to speak for me. Either aesthetic experience would have remained a chaos, which it is not altogether, or it must have tended to conciliate certain general human demands and ultimately all those interests which its operation in any way affects. The more conspicuous and permanent a work of art is, the more is such an adjustment needed. A poet or philosopher may be erratic and assure us that he is inspired. If we cannot well gainsay it, we are at least not obliged to read his works. An architect or a sculptor, however, or a public performer of any sort that thrusts before us a spectacle justified only in his inner consciousness makes himself a nuisance. The social standard of taste must assert itself here, or else no efficacious and culminative art can exist at all. Good taste in such matters cannot abstract from tradition, utility, and the temper of the world. It must make itself an interpreter of humanity and think esoteric dreams less beautiful than what the public eye might conceivably admire. There are various affinities by which art may acquire a representative or classic quality. It may do so by giving form to objects which everybody knows, by rendering experiences that are universal and primary. The human figure, elementary passions, common types and crises of fate, these are facts which pass too constantly through a perception not to have a normal aesthetic value. The artist who can catch that effect in its fullness and simplicity accordingly does immortal work. This sort of art immediately becomes popular. It passes into language and convention so that its aesthetic charm is apparently worn down. The old images after a while hardly stimulate unless they be presented in some paradoxical way, but in that case attention will be diverted to the accidental extravagance, and the chief classic effect will be missed. It is the honorable fate or euthanasia of artistic success that they pass from the field of professional art altogether and become a portion of human faculty. Every man learns to be to that extent an artist. Approved figures and maxims pass current like the words and idioms of a mother tongue, themselves once brilliant inventions. The luster of such successes is not really dimmed, however, when it becomes a part of man's daily light. A retrogression from the habitual style or habitual insight would at once prove, by the shock it caused, how precious those ingrained apperceptions continue to be.